Hello, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shaw. I'm the facilitator here. And I'm pleased to announce that we are continuing with our series on the Pacific Northwest with a little bit of family history and local history. And I just wanted to also announce that Community Conversations is going to be on hiatus for winter term. So we're going to take a break. We're going to do a fall series that we're doing right now. We're going to be off during the winter, and then we're going to be back in the spring. So keep an eye on our website. That's where you're going to get the most recent information for when we get the spring series set up. But I want to also thank the administration for allowing us to be a little flexible on some of the some of the difficulties that especially winter quarter presents to us. As I'm sure many of you remember, we have had to do cancellations for snow and some other reasons and stuff like that. Anyway, besides that, I do want to welcome a regular speaker in our series here. So we've been lucky to have Mark Gaither do several community conversations over the past on a variety of topics, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say this week. Mark is a tenure track instructor in the business technology program here at LCC. He possesses an undergraduate degree in science education from Portland from the University of Phoenix in curriculum and instruction. Mark began his full-time teaching career in 1988 and has been operating a part-time business for 35 years, most recently launching a comic book publishing company. Please welcome Mark Gaither.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Courtney. That's awesome. Thank you all for showing up. This is great. It's a chance to talk about something that obviously has been near and dear to my heart for a long time. And I'm sure one of the things I want to kind of preface this with, all of us have a family history. And one of the things that's great about this with technology advances and just communication advances, it's easier for us to look at that family history. You can get online now and for free do a lot of genealogy research. You know, most of the genealogy research that got me interested in looking more closely at my family history was because of my youngest sister, Mona. She decided she wanted to know about her family history, and that included me. And so she sucked me in, which is like good and bad in a variety of ways. But it's worth doing. It's worth just going back and looking at your family history. You know, we all have heard stories. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the stories are true. Some of the stories have an element of truth, and some of the stories are not true in all of our family histories. And so it's interesting to discover that information. So this is actually for the Gaither side of my family, which is obviously my father, my grandfather. So my grandfather was Marcus. Even though it looks like it's spelled Marquise, it was pronounced Marcus. And then my father was Robert, and then my little sister Mona. Or not. So, or not again. There we go. How many of you are familiar with this local site? This is over in Kelso High School. This is the Gaither Pool. And when I moved to Rainier 24 years ago, I'd occasionally be over here and people, oh, is that the same Gaither as the Gaither Pool? Going, yeah, probably, because my grandfather would tell us that every Gaither is related somehow. And so it's like, okay, well, great. And you know, even slaves from the slavery period would take on the name of the owners in a lot of cases. And so, you know, there's cross-cultural Gaithers that appear, and we're technically related. So, so the Gaither Pool was named for a cousin of mine who was the principal for the middle school, the Kelso Middle School, the older Kelso Middle School that had a fire, and then they demolished it, and people collect the bricks from it. So my sense of family history was very limited growing up. There you can see my grandfather on the left. At this time the photo was taken, he was 91, my father was 54, and I was 6. But if you do the math, this is circa 1967, you would discover my grandfather was born in 1876. And he grew up in what was Washington Territory at the time. And actually ran a tugboat, one of the first steam-powered tugboats on the Columbia. He was a pilot across the bar. He helped the Coast Guard when they were still in longboats. He would help them rescue survivors from shipwrecks. So he had a colorful history. But what was even more interesting was the history of his father. And that this pioneer history kind of centers around his father. And so we'll talk closely about that. So looking back, and this is a bunch of information here, and I'm not going to click on all of these links, but I've got some links attached to these. If you look up in the, he says, if you look up in the upper part here, this is not my great-grandfather, but this is my Perry Gaither was my great-great-grandfather. Okay, so these are the children of Perry Gaither, and we're going to look at a picture here in a minute. But it turns out they actually had more than, well, they had 10 children. But you know, you can see that some of them lasted quite a bit. My great-grandfather was Joseph Louis Gaither, who was born in 1842, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. You can see here my great, and this is always a question how you say this, great-grand-uncle. So my great-grandfather's brother, who was older, was also a pioneer locally. And we'll talk, I'm going to talk about both of them because their history is intertwined. One of the things that you'll notice up here is one of the things that happens quite often, especially when we're talking about territorial information, is that information can be collected wrong back in the day because we didn't have computers and information was written down quite often, usually collected in some kind of census activity. And so you can see here that my great-grandfather asked for his military allowance after fighting in the Civil War to be upgraded from $15 a month to $18 a month. And the interesting part is he lived in supposedly, I can never do, Clallam County, which is up on the Olympic Peninsula, which I didn't even know was a county in Washington State until I looked at it last night. And it was the wrong place. That's not where they lived. But it was it's the information that was recorded during that period of time. And it's important you remember this. Mistakes happen as you go back and you look at the research, and the mistakes are just inherent in the research. Okay, so this is my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, Joseph Louis Gaither and Sarah Jane Webb. In the picture, the 1866 picture, he is 22 and she is 15. All right. And then you do a little more math, and she's in her mid-30s in the circa 88 picture, and he's in his early 40s. What do you notice that's obvious in the picture about Joseph Gaither? His eye. Yes, he was shot at the Battle of Shiloh with a musket ball, which is 0.6 of an inch in diameter, 0.6 caliber. He was shot through the eye with a musket ball, and he lived. Right? It not only did it take out his eye, it took out part of his hearing canal. It broke his jaw. It damaged his other eye, and it took out part of his nasal cavity. He was 19 when it happened. He was 19 at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay. So this is Sarah Gaither with 4 of her children. I put this together because the individual in the middle here is my grandfather, the picture that you saw in the first slide. And this is People used to call him, other than me, calling him grandfather. Everybody else used to call him Uncle Mark. Okay. He never went by Marcus. He always went by Mark, or grandfather or Uncle Mark. And so here he is at his 92nd birthday, I believe. Here he is again, right here. Okay. So this is my great uncle Frank, who is here. And this is my great uncle George, who is here. This is my great uncle Perry, who was significantly older than the other three. He was the oldest child of Joseph and Sarah. And you can see at this point in time, Joseph has passed away. He died in his mid-50s. I want to click on a link because a lot of my research originally was based upon my little sister's research, which 20 years ago was primarily being done by hand and communication with other family members. Now you can go online, and this is Family Search. And if you look at this, it's great. I actually went back to a couple generations in this particular search. So Joseph Louis Gaither, right here, was the son of Perry Gaither and Elizabeth Ann Ketchum. And the great thing about this site, this family search site, number one, you can do a lot of the searching for free, but if you click on a person, so I'm going to click on my great-great-grandfather, and it will take me back to his parents and his siblings. So one of the things that I knew from stories within my family was that my original ancestor who came to the United States from England, John Gaither, came here in 1620 to Jamestown, Virginia. They named the ship. He came over on the George. He is listed like 6th under the list of the governor of the area at the time in Jamestown. He was there for a while. Then he went back to England and brought his wife and his son back to America. So imagine making, number one, that ocean voyage in 1620, same time as the Pilgrims, by the way. Okay. And then going back and then coming back again. And I kind of relate to it because now some of you know I fly halfway around the world twice a year. And I hate to fly. It's not that I hate to fly, I just hate the thought of crashing and burning. So I imagine myself being on an ocean-going ship thinking, oh, I hate the thought of sinking in the middle of the Atlantic, right? What was that like? And you spent months, in some cases, crossing the Atlantic, at least 3 weeks, but it was longer than that. So anyway, this is a real interesting site to look at. And the great thing about this site, even though I already had some of these pictures, if I go to my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Joseph Louis Gaither, you'll see that those pictures were uploaded to that site, not by me, but by another family member. And so it's fantastic to be able to grab these pictures. Still for that mode? I think so. I just want to show my grandmother's side of the family. So her family, I'm going to go back to my great-grandfather, but my grandmother's side of the family, Mona Gaither, Mona Baker in this case, she was about 16 in this picture, and that's her mother and her father on either side, came from Texas. So my grandfather was rooted locally, and my grandmother and her family came here from Texas. And you wonder, 100 and some odd years ago, how did these people meet, right? In Le Center, which is where a lot of this activity took place 100 plus years ago, there was only 405 people in the county. 405 what they would call white individuals in the county, because then they broke it up by white, colored, and Indians. And it turns out, according to the census of 1860, there was only one Indian in the county, one female Indian in the county. They undercounted on purpose, All right. So that's the only thing I'll show you Mona Gaither again at some point, but I just wanted to also include her in this piece. So imagine this is 1902. Now, do we think of that as being a pioneer process? But I want you to think in 1902, how would you get from southern Texas to Longview? You're not driving a car. You might take a train, but I don't think it would be a direct train ride at the time period. So you're traveling in a wagon at some point along the way. And if you look at even the clothing of the time period, you know, it was heavy clothing and it was delicate clothing in some ways, right? I mean, there was lace and there was bows and there was also wool and linen, all of this kind of stuff. Imagine riding around, especially as a woman, and traveling in a wagon to go across country. So the Battle of Shiloh. So Shiloh is near Harding, Tennessee. And the Battle of Shiloh was a Union victory, but it was a hard-won Union victory. And it was a very debilitating, demoralizing battle for the Union, especially even though the South lost, right? Because there were so many casualties. The picture that you see there on the right is the camp where my great-grandfather camped before the Battle of Shiloh with his company, Company G, 31st Indiana Regiment, right? And so, you know, they had to hike to get there. They had to wait. Then they had to hear the battle coming towards them because the Confederates launched the first strike in the battle. And so a lot of gunfire going on, okay? So I've got some videos. I'm not going to show you. Oh, come on. Seriously? Why would that be? That's so weird. Let's try and do this a different way. That's odd. Okay, I want to show you, oh, maybe it'll do it this way. Okay. No, because it worked last night. So let's try something else. And there was one that I truly wanted to show you, but I'm not going to. Let me show you this one. Oh.
In case you're wondering, black powder tastes horrible. All right, you bit the end of the cartridge open. Then you open it, you pour the powder down the barrel. Now the end has the mini ball in here, but you just put the mini ball down. There's not enough room for the paper and the mini ball, but it makes a better sound if I put the paper in there to kind of simulate the mini ball. Take out the ramrod, turn it around, ram it, ramrod back, away, pick it up.
Now, some soldiers in the heat of battle forgot to take the ramrod out, and they ended up firing the ramrod at the enemy, which is just as effective as the mini ball to some extent, but then you can't fire again because you have no way to ram the next cartridge down in there.
Pull it back to the half-cock position. That's where going off half-cock comes from. Then you reach into your little cap pouch in here, and you pull out one of these little musket caps. Put that on there. What happens is when the hammer hits that, it shoots a flame. This is fulminated mercury, shoots a flame down in through here, which hits the powder charge, fires the musket. So as soon as you're ready to fire it, pull it back to the full cock position. You're now loaded, ready to fire. If you don't like loud noises, put your fingers in your ears at this point. Hi, Rod.
The funny thing I like about that is we see the guy in the background with the camera walking by. He goes, "Hi, Rod," and then he fires. It's like, what happened to Rod? But the reason I show you this, because keep in mind, Joseph Gaither was shot by one of these rifles, right? And when we talk about the size of the musket ball, it's essentially the size of your little finger. So imagine a hot piece of lead cutting through your eyeball in the middle of a heated battle, and you're incapacitated at that point. And if you look at there's another video, I won't show it to you, but if you look at, they shoot it through a 1,000-page book, and it goes in a nice little hole, and it comes out shredding the backside of the book. So imagine how lucky he was to have survived that shot. The interesting piece, if you look into the battle history, the interesting piece with this is that they needed to, a soldier needed to be able to fire 3 rounds per minute. Well, if you do the math, and a company is 100 men firing 3 rounds per minute, you have 300 pieces of hot lead coming from one side and another 300 pieces of hot lead from the other side every minute of that battle, right? So it's a surprise that anybody survived this, really. Skip those. Or not. So I wanted to put together a map, because when we talk about pioneering, we talk about moving from one place to another. And I think when we talk about pioneering, really a definition of that is westward expansion, right? And so if you look at this map, and this is great because it's somewhat of an interactive Google map, which you can make your own of these. So Jamestown, Virginia is right here. If I click on the map, right? Jamestown, Virginia. Oh, and it didn't pull up the map I wanted. Would be over here. And I can click on the different points of the map, and I can see what was happening along the way, or I can see the current location of some of these events as we're moving along, and you can build in your own pictures into this, which is great. So in the presentation here, you can see I did the early work in the 16 and 1700s. Whoops. I did the early work in the 16 and 1700s of my family over here. Gaithersburg, Maryland is named for Benjamin Gaither, who originally settled in that area around Washington, D.C. Okay. And so then we go, and Joseph Gaither and his family, his father and mother, lived in Indiana. Turns out they lived in Bloomington, Indiana. And actually, as a young man, I visited Bloomington, Indiana, not knowing that that's where my great-grandfather grew up. And Bloomington, Indiana, if you've ever been there, it's wonderful. It's actually one of the best parts of Indiana. It's not that far from Indianapolis, but it's a wonderful country. So even the family transitioning from here during westward expansion, right, in the mid 1700s, was a process. You're moving, especially the time of year that you might be moving, you're moving a good 300, 400, 450 miles through Indian territory, through heavy wooded areas. It was not an easy process. Okay, so so at 19, Joseph Gaither enlists in the Civil War, right, on the Union side, and he ends up in 1862 at the Battle of Shiloh. Gets wounded in the eye and is left on the field. Now, there's an account from one of my cousins an account of what happened to people and a possible account of what happened to my great-grandfather. So he gets wounded, he's left on the field, somebody picks him up off the field and takes him to a field hospital. Now, they didn't pick him up when he immediately got shot. He didn't get picked up until the battle was over, which could have been an hour or more. So he's lying on, right? Imagine, picked up, taken to a field hospital. Luckily, the bullet had exited his skull, because had it not, they would have gone probing for the bullet. And the problem is, in the field hospitals at that time period, the doctors didn't wash their hands. And most casualties died because of infection. Okay. After the field hospital, he spent about 3 weeks in another hospital. Nobody knew where he was, right? We didn't have instant messaging back then, right? Everything was done by letters. So imagine as a young 19-year-old with this horrible wound, right? Now, here's the thing that I find amazing. If we jump back to that slide that I showed you of Joseph and Sarah, Sarah's 15. Joseph at that point is about 23 when they got married. She chose to marry a veteran who's got an eye patch. 15-year-old girl. At 15 years old, how many of you would have even looked at the guy with the eye patch, right? I find it amazing that what brought these two people together, if we relate it to our current times, our current point of view. And when we talk about pioneering, one of the things I think that's important is how does it relate to our experiences? How can we compare what we experience with what they may have experienced? And here's the great thing. The reason I like to center all of this around Joseph Gaither is because I have a visceral connection to him. I knew my grandfather, his son. Because of that connection, I mean, I spent time with him day in, day out, spent time with my grandfather. Because of that personal connection with somebody who was born in 1876, I have a personal connection then with his father, right? And so this story is very impactful because I have that visceral connection. I knew what my grandfather was like. I can imagine for him what his father was like. So they had to get from Indiana, and it's an interesting story. They moved at the behest of other family members who had already come to Washington Territory in the 1850s. Sarah and Joseph in the late 1860s moved to Washington Territory. And the only way to get here in that time period was by covered wagon. That was the only way to get here in that time period, or walk, or there's a combination of covered wagon, walking, and riding. Now, it's interesting. If you go back and look at the history of wagons, this is actually where they ended up. They ended up in the center. Okay, so they ended up in the center. And to get here, you had to buy a wagon. You had to own a wagon or buy a wagon. You could borrow one from somebody, but that was risky. So there's different types of wagon manufacturers in this time period. This was a huge industry. Wagon manufacturing in this time period was like car manufacturing is today. So here we have a Conestoga wagon. So this has been returned or brought back in review back in 2019 at the Oregon Historical Society downtown. I remember being 8 years old and going to the Oregon Historical Society in its original building and seeing this wagon. And my father told me that was the wagon that the family donated to the Oregon Historical Society. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. But I know that my father would know that this is the type of wagon that they came across in. Because this is what we call a prairie schooner. And it looks like, if you look at it from the side, it looks like a boat. And it's designed, and you can see here in this demonstration that they have at the Oregon Historical Society, it's designed to move through water. The front ends are raised up like a boat. The canvas stretches out farther over the front and over the back end of the wagon. It's very sturdy. It's got high sides, so you don't sink if you don't overload it. Right? It's got a low center of gravity, so you don't tend to topple over. Okay. So this was an integral part of stuff. And people who made and repaired wagons were an integral part of society. Now, the wagon that you see in the center here, you can see it has the ribs for the canvas over it. This is most likely, based upon the way it looks, a wagon that was manufactured by Studebaker. And Studebaker, if you're familiar with your car history, after wagons transitioned out, Studebaker started making cars. And then their cars petered out in the 1950s. Okay, so these were people who were in the vehicle making business for almost 100 years. Right? And this was a typical vehicle. I heard a statement from who's the astronomer? Yes, Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about the transition to autonomous vehicles, right? And he was putting it in the same perspective that I'm trying to give you. He said his children are not interested in learning how to drive. They don't have a license. They don't want to get behind the wheel of a car. They're waiting for autonomous vehicles. And it was the same thing in this time period when we got into the early 1900s. The transition from horses and wagons to automobiles happened in a 20-year span. Everybody, there's this huge industry, feeding horses, taking care of horses, making wagons, all of these things that our society had been dependent upon for hundreds of years. And in 20 years, it all, for the most part, went away. My father, in the mid to late 1920s, he was born in 1913. So when he was essentially 17, 16, late 29, 30, he was driving around a Model A on dirt and mud roads in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. There was a point where when they came across country, they were coming across to meet a family, and they were going to meet them at Shoals Ferry, which is near Tualatin. So how many of you grew up in the Pacific Northwest? How many of you are familiar with the Cathlamet Ferry? Okay, that's been a ferry forever. It's just more modernized. I remember riding those ferries when I was 6 years old across Cathlamet. There used to be a ferry at Shoals Ferry, which we would ride, and there used to be a ferry at Boone's Ferry. So all of those names where a ferry is attached to it, there was physically a ferry there, and they used to actually ferry people and horses and cars and all of these things forever, and eventually they've now gone away. I think the Cathlamet Ferry is really one of the few that are still around operating. It's very interesting. So they had different numbers of teams that would pull the wagons. And you could pull them by mules, you could pull by oxen, or you could pull them by horses. Horses weren't ideal for pulling wagons because they tired faster and they required more resources. Mules and oxen were better. Could you imagine hooking up and driving 2 mules to a wagon? Could you do it? We're not trained to do it. This one has 4 mules. It was rare that somebody could drive a 6-mule team because you have to have a lead for every mule. My father, growing up in this time period when wagons and horses could drive a 6-mule team. And he did it as a stunt driver when they were making films down in Hollywood, making all the early Westerns, right? So because he grew up in this time period, it was a unique skill, but it still was a skill that if you grew up in this time period. So my father was on the tail end kind of that pioneering era, right? The 1920s, 1930s really ended pioneering. Oops, wrong way. So this is interesting. So my great-grandfather and his brother end up setting up in the center. They opened up, there was a general store there already, and my great-grand uncle, John Gaither, ended up opening up a store with another fellow in La Center. They ran the other store out of business. And part of what they did was they manufactured wood products. And what's really interesting here, so there's a number of industrial machines from the time period. And if you, if you look at this, this is a planing machine. It's made out of cast iron. There's another machine here, but this gentleman, who I believe, looking at him closely, is actually one of my other great grand uncles. Can't think of his name right now, but he's sitting on this device right here, and you can't see it very well. There's a table he's got his hands on. There's an arm right here. There's some pedals he's got his feet on. There's a wheel here. It is this machine right here. This is what they called a velocipede scroll saw. And you would use this, there would be a blade right here. You would pedal. This seat is actually adjustable. You would pedal, and this blade would go up and down, and you could cut this fancy scroll work. And I know that because I've used it. That's sitting in my house. Okay. I've only ever seen one other one face to face, and it was in the Smithsonian. Now, there are more online, but not many. It actually, in order to get here from the East Coast, it had to come around the Horn because the Panama Canal didn't exist. So it came around South America to San Francisco and was sold at Osborne and Alexander in San Francisco down on Market Street. And at the time period, you know, they were selling this type of equipment. So this is the late 1800s, right? But after this, when people stopped buying this, Alexander and Osborne started selling bicycles. And if you look at their catalogs online, you will see these large front-wheeled, right, and smaller back-wheeled velocipedes, right? Because they had the same workings as this machine. So this is a visceral connection. My great-grandfather used this machine. So in doing the research, my little sister does all this, and you know, then I find out, oh, I've got ancestors all the way back to 1620, and I've got local ancestors. And if you go to the Center, Washington, there's Timmins Landing. Well, it turns out one of my family members, one of the women in my family, married the Tibbins man, who's a founder of the Center. They met in the 1850s. He used to ferry people and food from the Dalles to Portland, right? When we talk about ferrying, we're talking about land ferrying, not river ferrying. And there's an entry in the process where they were traveling, where they stopped in the Dalles because it was too windy to move forward. And Joe Timmins brings out potatoes for the kids, and the kids were so happy to get potatoes because they haven't had potatoes for 6 months while they were traveling across country. I mean, what did you eat? Right? And we could go into that. That could be a whole nother story. So this is the Pioneer Cemetery in La Center. And I have you looking at this cedar tree here. Whoops. I have you looking at this cedar tree right here. This is the same cedar tree because in 1850, this is where my great-grandfather, who died in 1853, this is where his grave was. But in 1853, this tree didn't look like this, right? I don't even know that there was necessarily a tree there. This was added after Sarah died, which was 1912, right? So it may have been the original spot. It was not the original gravestone. What's interesting is next to the gravestone, just around the corner of the tree, is this marker. And this marker is my great-grandfather's war veterans marker for his grave. And so you can see there, it says on it, Joseph Gaither, private, no, company H, yes, 31st Indiana Infantry. Okay, And every veteran of the period, no matter when they died, would get these markers. And these were standard markers from that Civil War period. And you could see these all over the battlefields, these same types of markers. So I started looking around at the other grave sites. This cemetery, just across from the high school in the center, is littered with Gaithers. Maybe that's a poor phrase. But here is my great-grandfather's grave marker. Here is his brother John's grave marker. John was the postmaster in the center for 40 years. Right? 40 years he was the postmaster. He also was in the war, right? He actually had arrived about the same time that Joseph did to there. These are some of John's children, right? And when you look at the time periods, then we start getting up into the early 1900s. It's very interesting to me that people lived there and didn't leave because it was a small, tiny community. How many of you have been to La Center? Right? It's still a small little cottage community. There's a Gaither Street in La Center, by the way. And there's a Timmins Landing, which all of those things. And so, here is an example of my family coming to the Pacific Northwest, right? And actually creating part of our society. And I find it amazing because I didn't know a lot of these details. And I've got pages and pages of stuff. One of my cousins has, which is very rare, has Joseph Gaither's discharge papers from the Army during the Civil War, an official discharge paper. So I'm trying to actually track that down because it's been framed and put in some museum, but I still can't find where. But that's so rare to actually have that because they didn't give them out to people typically because there was so much chaos during the war. You never got an official document. The only reason he got the official document because after he was shot at the Battle of Shiloh, right? He was in hospital for a while and they couldn't keep him. That's a mortal wound. They're not going to keep you because they think you're going to die anyway at some point, right? So they discharged him and they gave him his discharge papers. And they kept those, which is amazing in and of itself. This is a Gaither family reunion circa 1950. And there was no date on this photograph. I have this photograph. There was no date on this photograph. The only reason I know it's circa 1950 is because right here is my father's first cousin. We, as kids, we called her Aunt Jerry. She's actually my second cousin. But she was, when I was 10, she was 50. Okay. And these are her sisters here. This is my Aunt Margaret. Back here is my father. I don't know, he was actually a black sheep of the family. So there's my Uncle Bill right there. Here is my grandfather. Right. Here is his brother. I think that's Uncle George right there. And I think this is Uncle Frank right here. Frank died not long after this picture was taken. And then there's other people I recognize. Here is my grandmother, Mona, who my little sister is named for. And I'm named for my grandfather, Marcus, but not Marcus, Mark. And she died not long after this picture was taken. 1956, I believe. He lived until 1971. Okay. So here's and this was circa 1950. This was the extent of the Gaither family in the Pacific Northwest. After his father immigrated from Indiana after being shot at the Battle of Shiloh. To me, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that my great-grandfather survived. Imagine being that mortal wound and traveling 6 months or more across country in a covered wagon. very little access to water, very little access to normal sanitation. All of the you know, food issues that you would have to deal with. You were probably malnourished by the time you got here. And yet, you know, this is what comes out of it. Think about how hardy you have to be. I mean, I'm sure most of you have been camping at least one point in your life. Imagine camping for 6 months while you're traveling. And if you've been across country, which I have several times in a car, because that's what we did, because my dad still had that kind of pioneer mentality, we drove 3,000 miles in 4 days. That was brutal. Okay. Imagine it taking 6 months. And on the way, I'll tell you one time on one trip, this is really interesting. So we're traveling. I was, oh my gosh, I had to be 7, 8, probably. We're going through Utah. We're going through the Great Salt Flats. We're driving in this old station wagon, right? And I'm sitting in the back, no seat belt, because we didn't do seat belts back then. And I'm back there, and all of a sudden, I start feeling weird. I get sick. I get heat stroke. 7 years old and I get heat stroke. Now we're traveling through the Great Salt Flats in 1968. Okay, there's not a lot there now. There was not a lot there then. And my parents, we were poor. The chances of us pulling over and stopping at a hotel were 0. Except I got so sick, I had a temperature of 105. I remember being carried into the hotel room because I thought, oh, we're staying at a hotel. This is cool. I have a temperature of 105. I mean, it's like barely awake. But I remember going into that hotel room, and then I remember being plunged into an ice bath because the closest doctor was 100 miles away. That was a 4-day trip in an automobile. Imagine what would happen to a child 6 months. They didn't survive. They didn't survive. So that pioneering effort is unheard of. We in America don't experience that anymore. All right. So I want to show you one other image. I was going to bring it, but I want to talk about it because it's important. Do I have a few more minutes left? Couple. Okay. Let's see if I can pull it up here. So there was this long history about my grandfather's Civil War sword. And I thought I shared it to this drive, but it's not showing up. Because I wanted to show you a picture. Interesting, because it says I shared it. Anyway, I can describe it. So I almost brought my great-grandfather's Civil War saber. Here's the interesting piece I want you to think about. So the saber is a normal length of a saber. It's curved. Okay. Now, my great-grandfather Joseph was a private in an infantry company. Okay. Mortally wounded at the Battle of Shiloh in 2 separate hospitals for 3 weeks. One, I want you to think about what are the chances that he actually was able to keep a saber with him from being wounded on the battlefield. Now, maybe it was attached to him and maybe they just kept it with him. Maybe. But here's another thing. A curved saber is not an infantry saber. It's a cavalry saber. It is curved to match the flank of the horse. Because you don't want that saber, you don't want the saber in the scabbard jabbing the horse as it's running, right? Because it can do all kinds of, basically it trips the horse up. Or it gets shoved up into your ribs as the horse's leg pushes against that. So the curved one prevents that. So wait a minute. Now, the other side of that is a number of people who went into battle brought swords from home. So this could have been a sword from a war that his father may have fought in, or his grandfather, the War of 1812. may have fought in. And it matches because when I pull out the insignia on the sword, the stars and stripes that are on there do not match the stars and stripes of the time period. So more likely it was a war from a previous period. But again, this sword's really well preserved. The scabbard is there. The scabbard had broken, but it was repaired at one point. But what's even, and all the ivory is on the handle, which is even more amazing because usually you find them and they're missing ivory. But what's even more interesting is it had a companion weapon with it. So in the cavalry, in war, even in the Civil War, an officer had two things. They had their saber. Well, they also had a pistol, but they had their saber and they had a billy club. Use the billy club in case you wanted to smash somebody in the brains instead of stabbing them. Okay. It's not this long of a billy club because you're on horseback. It's a billy club that's this long. That billy club is in perfect condition. There is not a scratch or a dent on it. So here's the question. This is where there's some confusion around the stories that are told, items that might be passed along, and is that story and are those items actually associated with that person? Was that a sword that might have been used in the Civil War? Yes. Was it the sword that was given to my, or that my great-grandfather brought to the Civil War? Most likely not. It was probably one he picked up as a memento after the period. Okay, after the events. Here's another one, and this goes back even farther. So there was a story that my father used to tell that my great-great-great ancestor who came here in 1620 was a descendant of some royalty in England. And he was the youngest brother and came here because the youngest brother out of three brothers would get nothing from the family. The first brother would get everything. The second brother would go into the clergy of some type. And the third brother and subsequent brothers would get nothing in inheritance. So there was this story. So actually I went back and I started looking, and there's this story in the Gaither lineage that talks about that John Gaither, who came here from England, was actually a descendant of a duke who worked with William the Conqueror in 1066. Well, that's what we call a fake lineage. My grand descendant in 1620, because he came over at a higher status level in society, was granted land. In order to get a land grant, there had to be some type of lineage attached to it that showed that you came from some level of royalty. Because keep in mind, in 1620, this was still a British colony, and the transition, right, of land, especially, was only given to the aristocracy. It was not, you couldn't get hundreds of acres, and John Gaither was granted 350 acres of land. So, you know, the fact that, you know, I'm related to somebody who traveled around with William the Conqueror, and there's this royalty, or not royalty, but this bloodline, this, what do we call that? Higher order bloodline there. That's fake. That's not real. So you have to really pay attention to, as you're going through your own genealogy, what stories can you root in fact, and what stories are made up because we just do this thing as human beings. We misinterpret the story, we mishear it, we add to it, we embellish it, we do all of these wonderful things to make it sound richer than it is. Anyway, questions from anybody?
Come around.
Hakaya, go ahead.
I was wondering, researching your genealogy, who puts that stuff in there?
It's interesting. So
Do the Mormons do it?
that family search is controlled by the Church of Latter-day Saints. And it's interesting. I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. The closer you get to your generation, the less chance you will see information on that family search history about your personal family, because if you're not part of the Church of Latter-day Saints, nobody's putting anything in for you. So
You never were.
if you never were, you might not see something. But the great thing about it is what the church believes is that at some point there was somebody in your family that was connected in some way. And so they go back to do that research to carry on, and you're probably more familiar with this than I am, to carry on that patronage of showing how far back your descendants were involved in the belief.
And they also baptize.
Yes.
That's a controversy.
Yeah. But it's like, yeah, you can assign belief, right? Because the belief, you would carry that belief forward. And it's interesting. So in my family, originally, they began in England in the Episcopalian church, in the Episcopal church. Okay. And when they came here, they ended up being more Puritan and had broken away. But a couple generations later, they went back to the Episcopal church. And my father actually was raised as an Episcopalian. 12 generations of that in the United States. It's an interesting process. Go ahead.
Can they, if you do this, can you be tracked?
Well, that's another issue. I don't think I don't think privacy actually exists. There's a Gaither society for preserving the Gaither genealogy in America. And I went onto the website and I actually, for the first time, signed up to the website. And it's like, they want all your information. And I thought the exact same thing. Can I be tracked? But it's like, you can find you anyway.
I
So,
couldn't give out my information, so I probably wouldn't be able to do this.
well, you'd be surprised. You don't have to give out your information. You can just go look. Yeah. Other questions?
Like a high figure or a low?
At the time period in the late 1800s, you know, I don't have some specifics on that, but I can tell you that if you, in the early 1900s, if you were buying a car, like a Model A, you were only spending about $300 for that car.
Yeah, 18's pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
And the pension system is the Civil War pension system was one of the first sort of like bureaucratic welfare systems that the United States created. And so the Grand Army of the Republic really, you know, like pre-Social Security, pre-disability, anything like that. This is really the model that was used for a lot of that.
And I was surprised that he, you know, he originally was on a $15 a month pension. I was surprised that he was able to ask and was granted a $3 increase. That's amazing, you know, because you think about it, he's here and that process had to happen all the way back to Washington, D.C. for that to happen. So you imagine the amount of time that took. Now, there were agents who were doing it, but still, it was a hefty process. Other questions?
I believe we are out of time.
We are out of time.
But thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Mark for presenting your information.
Thank you all. You like that? Oh, good. Awesome. Thank you. If you want to see a picture of the saber, I have it on my